Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than anyone. 303 billion barrels sitting beneath the Orinoco Belt. And yet, by 2024, 73% of Venezuelans lived in poverty. 7.7 million people have fled the country. The economy contracted 80% in 7 years. That's worse than the Great Depression. Worse than the Soviet collapse. This is the single largest peacetime economic implosion in modern history. How does a country with more oil than anyone end up here? Because Venezuela's collapse isn't just about bad governance or corruption. It's a case study in what happens when energy systems intersect with currency power. And what's happening there right now is a warning about what's coming for the entire petrodollar system. Let me show you how this actually works. In 1973, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger made a deal with Saudi Arabia that changed everything. America would provide military protection for Saudi oil fields. In exchange, the Saudis would price all their oil exclusively in United States dollars. Every barrel sold anywhere in the world had to be purchased with American currency. King Faisal agreed. OPEC followed. And suddenly, every country on Earth needed dollars just to keep their lights on. This wasn't an accident. The gold standard had just collapsed in 1971. The dollar was in free fall. Inflation was surging. Nixon needed something to replace gold as the anchor for American currency. Oil became that anchor, not because of its industrial value, though that mattered, but because oil created permanent structural demand for dollars that would last decades. Think about what this actually means. Japan needs oil. They can't buy it with yen. They have to acquire dollars first. China needs oil. Same problem. Europe, India, Brazil, everyone. They all need dollars before they can buy energy. So they export goods to America, accept payment in dollars, then use those dollars to buy oil. The entire global economy became a machine for generating dollar demand. And here's the beautiful part for America. When everyone needs your currency, you can print as much as you want. Other countries will hold it because they have no choice. They need it for energy. This is how the United States funds trillion-dollar deficits year after year. We export paper. The world accepts it because oil is priced in that paper. Venezuela had a different idea. Hugo Chavez took power in 1998. Oil prices were rising. Venezuela was sitting on those 303 billion barrels. And Chavez decided to leverage that oil for geopolitical independence. He provided subsidized goods and services to Venezuelans, cut extreme poverty by 15%, supported Cuba and other regional allies, and started questioning why Venezuela's oil had to be sold in dollars. But there was a problem nobody wanted to acknowledge. Venezuela's oil isn't the easy stuff. It's ultra-heavy crude from the Orinoco Belt. Dense, viscous, difficult to move. It requires heating, dilution with lighter hydrocarbons, and upgrading in specialized facilities before refineries can even process it. This technical complexity means production systems fail quickly, without constant reinvestment, reliable power, and uninterrupted access to diluents. Chavez didn't care about technical complexity. He cared about political control. Between 1998 and 2013, he transformed PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, from a capably managed operation into a dysfunctional patronage system run by military and political allies who lacked engineering expertise. Skilled technicians left. Foreign partners were expropriated, investment collapsed, and Venezuela's dependence on oil exports deepened catastrophically. In 1998, oil represented 71% of exports. By 2013, 98%. When oil prices were high, none of this mattered. Revenue covered the dysfunction, But in late 2014, crude prices collapsed. Suddenly, Venezuela faced a choice: fiscal austerity or monetary expansion. Cut spending to match revenue or print money to maintain programs. The government chose printing. The Central Bank of Venezuela lost all autonomy, becoming a printing press for the Ministry of Finance. Inflation began accelerating in 2016. By November, it crossed the technical threshold for hyperinflation: 50% monthly price increases. In 2018, annual inflation hit 130,000%. Prices doubled every 19 days. The government stripped 14 zeros from the currency in 13 years. Pure cosmetic accounting that changed nothing about the underlying collapse. And then the energy system broke. March 2019. Nationwide blackouts left millions without power, not for hours, for days. Because the electrical grid, like everything else, had been maintained with oil revenue that no longer existed. When the lights went out, the cascading effects became visible. Production halted, supply chains fractured. What remained of the economy seized up completely. This is where the pattern becomes critical. Energy infrastructure requires constant investment, technical expertise, and stable institutions. When any of those three fail, the system degrades quickly. When all three fail simultaneously, you get Venezuela. And once energy systems collapse, they create feedback loops throughout the entire economy. No power means no production. No production means no revenue. No revenue means no investment in power infrastructure. The spiral becomes self-reinforcing. By 2020, Venezuela's GDP had contracted 80%. But here's what makes this relevant beyond Venezuela's borders. The United States noticed and decided to accelerate the collapse through sanctions, not because of humanitarian concerns or democracy promotion. Because Venezuela had started selling oil in currencies other than dollars. In February 2018, Venezuela launched the Petro, a cryptocurrency supposedly backed by oil reserves, explicitly designed to circumvent dollar dependence. The response was systematic destruction. Primary sanctions froze Venezuela's assets in the United States and cut them off from the US oil market. But the real weapon was secondary sanctions on PDVSA. Any country or company doing business with Venezuela's state oil company would face US sanctions themselves. This cut Venezuela off from formal global oil markets entirely. The impact was mathematically devastating. Between January 2017 and December 2024, US-led sanctions cost Venezuela oil revenue equivalent to 213% of its GDP, $77 million per day in losses. PDVSA couldn't secure letters of credit to guarantee shipments, couldn't find insurance for tankers, couldn't maintain oil fields, couldn't conduct transactions with non-US entities who feared secondary exposure. Production collapsed from 3.2 million barrels per day in 2000 to 735,000 by September 2023. Venezuela became the 10th largest producer in OPEC, despite holding the world's largest reserves. The oil was still there, trapped underground, but the institutional capacity to extract it had been systematically destroyed. This is where the pattern connecting Venezuela to broader dollar dominance becomes explicit. Look at the historical precedent. In 2000, Iraq announced it would accept only euros for oil. Saddam Hussein was removed from power 3 years later. In 2011, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed pan-African currency to replace the dollar for oil transactions. NATO intervened that same year. Iran has sold oil in currencies other than dollars since 2012 and faces continuous sanctions pressure. Venezuela represents the latest iteration of this pattern, but with a crucial difference. It has China's economic backing and BRICS institutional support. When the petro-cryptocurrency failed in 2024, Venezuela didn't return to dollar dependence. It shifted to yuan-denominated transactions with Chinese buyers. Russia and Iran joined the same system. Together, These three countries control roughly 40% of the world's proven oil reserves, all now trading outside the dollar framework. The human cost in Venezuela became catastrophic. By 2017, 75% of the population had lost an average of 8 kilograms due to hunger. More than half lacked income to meet basic food needs. The monthly minimum wage dropped to 130 bolivars. That's 40 cents. Well below the UN's extreme poverty threshold of $2.15 per day. 7.7 million Venezuelans have emigrated since the crisis began. That's 28% of the population. One of the largest refugee crises in modern history, created not by war, but by economic implosion accelerated by financial warfare. The Gini coefficient measuring inequality rose from 40.7 in 2014 to 53.9 in 2024. Venezuela became the most unequal country in the Americas. By late 2025, Venezuela exists in what economists call a zombie economy. Not dead, but not alive. Oil production has crawled back toward 900,000 barrels per day, helped by specific licenses for Chevron and swap deals with Reliance Industries. But the banking sector remains credit-starved with 73% reserve requirements. Public utilities stay decimated. Sustainable growth is mathematically impossible under current conditions. 73% of the population lives in poverty. 7.9 million people require humanitarian assistance according to UN estimates. The economy remains less than half its 2013 size even after recent growth. Venezuela achieved a 5.3% GDP increase in 2024, but that's growth from a catastrophically reduced base, building back from rubble. The infrastructure damage alone tells the story. PDVSA pipelines haven't been updated in 50 years. Returning to peak production would require $58 billion in investment. Industry estimates suggest reaching 3 million barrels per day by 2040 demands $183 billion in total capital expenditure. 30 to 35 billion would need commitment in the next 2 to 3 years just to make that scenario plausible. Even companies ready to invest face massive obstacles. Chevron's vice chairman announced plans to boost production 50% in 18 to 24 months using existing infrastructure. Repsol's CEO expressed willingness to triple output in 2 to 3 years. But these are incremental improvements to a fundamentally broken system. Venezuela's oil wealth has transformed from active asset to stranded resource, requiring decades and hundreds of billions to fully rehabilitate. This matters beyond Venezuela because it reveals the mechanics of dollar weaponization. The ability to exclude nations from global financial systems creates leverage, but also incentivizes alternatives. Every sanction accelerates de-dollarization. Every country watching Venezuela's experience asks the same question. What happens when we challenge dollar hegemony? The answer shapes behavior. China became Saudi Arabia's largest oil customer, accounting for over 20% of the kingdom's exports. In 2023, China and Saudi Arabia completed their first yuan-denominated oil transaction. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange now trades yuan-denominated crude futures, representing 10.5% of global volume. These contracts still reference dollar benchmarks like WTI and Brent, and most transactions ultimately settle through traditional dollar channels, but the infrastructure for alternatives is being built. Russia, Iran, and Venezuela selling oil for yuan. Turkey, Argentina, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia all applying for BRICS membership. The coalition now represents 45% of global population, 35% of global GDP measured in purchasing power parity, and 30% of global oil production. The foundation Kissinger built in 1973 is cracking. Not collapsing overnight, but fragmenting steadily as countries develop alternatives and reduce dollar exposure. The petrodollar system's grip is loosening, because the weapon that made it powerful, sanctions, simultaneously drives creation of competing systems. Venezuela sits on a critical fault line in this transition. The country with the world's largest oil reserves selling outside the dollar framework, backed by the world's second largest economy. What happens next in Venezuela doesn't just determine one nation's fate. It signals whether the global monetary system transitions gradually or collapses catastrophically. Consider the historical precedent. High-priced oil allowed the USSR to support struggling Soviet bloc economies during the 1974 to 1981 petrodollar surge. When the 1980s oil glut hit, income vanished and the bloc collapsed by 1989. Venezuela played a similar role during the 2005 to 2014 surge, supporting Cuba and regional allies with oil wealth. Then the 2014 downturn arrived and Venezuela imploded. Energy price swings don't just affect budgets. They determine which governments survive and which systems fail. The difference this time is institutional backing. Venezuela isn't isolated. China provides economic support. BRICS offers alternative infrastructure. The playbook that worked against Iraq, Libya, and Iran faces different obstacles when the target has the world's second largest economy as a partner. Watch what countries are actually doing, not what they're saying. Saudi Arabia accepted yuan for oil sales. That's not rhetoric, that's transaction data. The Shanghai Energy Exchange processes yuan-denominated crude futures, representing over 10% of global volume. These contracts still reference dollar benchmarks and most settlement flows through traditional channels. But parallel infrastructure is being constructed systematically. Every nation watching Venezuela calculates risk differently now. Challenge dollar dominance and face sanctions. Accept dollar dominance and remain vulnerable to American financial leverage. Neither option feels safe anymore, so they build alternatives while maintaining dollar relationships. Hedging, not abandoning, but hedging at scale eventually becomes transition. The climate factor accelerates everything. Renewable energy adoption weakens the oil-dollar connection structurally. As the world shifts from hydrocarbons to electricity, the commodity that anchored dollar dominance for 50 years becomes less central to global commerce. The petrodollar system's foundation erodes not just from geopolitical challenge, but from technological transformation. Venezuela's zombie economy exists in this transition space. Not recovered, not completely destroyed, but suspended between systems. Oil flows at reduced capacity. Transactions occur outside traditional dollar channels. Chinese investment provides lifelines. The country functions as a laboratory for what post-petrodollar commerce might resemble. The human cost remains staggering. 7.7 million people fled. 73% live in poverty. Monthly minimum wage sits at 40 cents. These aren't just statistics. They're lives destroyed by the collision between domestic dysfunction and international power politics. When great powers use economies as weapons, ordinary people become casualties. Here's what Venezuela actually proves. Energy-dependent economies are vulnerable during monetary system transitions. Challenging dollar hegemony without institutional capacity to manage the shift results in catastrophic failure. Sanctions work devastatingly well against isolated targets, but drive systematic development of alternatives. And the petrodollar system that seemed permanent 5 decades ago shows clear signs of fragmentation. The pattern repeats because the incentives remain constant. America uses dollar dominance to project power. Targeted nations seek alternatives to escape vulnerability. Rising powers build competing infrastructure to challenge American hegemony. Each cycle of sanctions accelerates the next stage of de-dollarization, but fragmentation creates chaos before it creates stability. The transition from one monetary system to another generates winners and losers, and the losers rarely accept their fate peacefully. Venezuela's collapse offers a preview of what happens in the gap between systems, when old structures break down faster than new ones can be built. The mathematics are unforgiving. 213% of GDP lost to sanctions between 2017 and 2024. $77 million per day in vanished oil revenue. 80% GDP contraction. These numbers exceed Great Depression impacts. They rival wartime destruction, and they demonstrate the raw power of financial exclusion in a dollar-dominated system. That power is precisely what drives countries toward alternatives. Russia, Iran, and Venezuela collectively control 40% of proven oil reserves, and all three now sell crude for yuan. Not because yuan is superior to dollars, but because dollars come with strings that can strangle. When the weapon becomes too powerful, targets find ways to neutralize it. The United States became the world's largest oil producer and a net exporter. Energy independence was supposed to strengthen American power. Instead, it weakened the petrodollar system by reducing how much other countries needed to hold dollars for energy purchases. China became Saudi Arabia's largest customer. The country that created the petrodollar system no longer needs Saudi oil. The country positioned to replace American dominance does. Kissinger understood in 1973 that controlling the currency of energy transactions meant controlling global commerce. That insight built 5 decades of American financial hegemony. But systems designed for one era don't automatically function in the next. The world Kissinger navigated no longer exists. The leverage that arrangement provided is diminishing. Venezuela sits at the center of this transformation not because of what it did right, but because of everything it represents. Largest oil reserves, complete economic collapse, survival outside dollar systems, backing from rising powers, evidence of both sanction effectiveness and the reaction sanctions provoke. One country containing all the elements reshaping global monetary architecture. What comes next isn't predetermined. Maybe the dollar maintains dominance through adaptation. Maybe BRICS creates functional alternatives. Maybe the transition generates chaos that benefits no one. Multiple futures remain possible. But the trajectory is clear. The petrodollar system that defined international commerce since 1973 is fragmenting, and Venezuela's catastrophic experience illuminates why that fragmentation is accelerating and what the human cost of monetary system collapse actually looks like. 50 years of dollar dominance ending not with declaration, but with gradual erosion. Countries diversifying reserves. Alternative payment systems gaining functionality. The currency that purchased global compliance, losing its monopoly on international energy transactions. And Venezuela, broken and desperate, inadvertently demonstrating that survival outside the dollar system is possible, even if barely. That's the lesson other nations are learning. Not that challenging dollar dominance is safe, but that alternatives exist when you have powerful enough partners. The petrodollar era is ending because the conditions that created it no longer apply. The energy system always breaks first. Not because energy infrastructure is uniquely fragile, but because it reveals what governments actually prioritize when resources become scarce. Venezuela chose political control over technical competence. The grid failed. The currency collapsed. 7.7 million people fled. And the world watched a country with more oil than Saudi Arabia descend into poverty that rivals war zones. But Venezuela's collapse isn't the end of this story. It's the beginning of the next chapter. Every country observing what happened is making calculations right now about dollar dependence, sanction vulnerability, and alternative systems. The petrodollar arrangement that anchored global commerce for 5 decades is fragmenting because the weapon that made it powerful also makes it unsustainable. You can't exclude nations from the financial system without eventually forcing them to build competing infrastructure. 50 years from now, historians will look back at Venezuela as the inflection point. Not because it was the largest economy or the most powerful nation, but because it was the first country with massive oil reserves to survive complete exclusion from dollar-dominated markets. That survival, barely functional as it is, proves the system Kissinger built isn't permanent, and once enough countries believe alternatives are possible, the transition becomes inevitable. The only question is whether it happens gradually or catastrophically. Venezuela already showed us what catastrophic looks like.